What if the world you once knew, the understanding you held about right and wrong, about justice and suffering, was turned completely on its head? Imagine a life where every certainty you've ever held is challenged. What if the righteous suffer, the wicked prosper, and the very heavens seem silent as you bear the weight of unimaginable loss? What if the world around you looks like it has lost all sense of order? The Book of Job isn't just an ancient story. Its core message echoes through time, touching the lives of anyone who has ever felt lost, betrayed, or abandoned in the face of hardship. Job's trials are more than just a tale of divine testing. They reflect a raw human experience of grappling with the big questions that haunt every generation. As we embark on this journey into Job's life, let's step into the ancient world where this story unfolds. Picture yourself in a land of vast, dry plains where the sun beats down relentlessly and the winds whisper through the arid landscape. This is where Job lived, a man who had everything: wealth, family, health, and respect. Yet all of it was stripped away in the blink of an eye. How could someone so righteous, so faithful, experience such devastating loss? His story is not just about loss. It is about faith being tested, about standing in the face of confusion and despair. Job's pain and his cry for understanding are as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. Job's journey leads him through a series of intense questions about life, suffering, and divine justice. Yet through it all, he struggles with the silence of God. When we experience suffering, we often wonder, where is God in all this? It feels as if our cries fall on deaf ears. Job asks these same questions, but his answers, though not simple, offer us timeless wisdom. In this exploration of Job's life, we will delve deep into the heart of his story. We will examine the fierce loss he endured, the death of his children, the destruction of his wealth, and the ravaging of his health. But we will also explore something even more powerful: his response to it all. How did Job's faith hold up in the face of such relentless suffering? How did he move from pain to a deeper understanding of God's nature? And as we unfold this story, we will realize that Job's journey is one that transcends his time. It speaks to us about finding strength in our own suffering, about standing firm in our faith when the world seems unjust. It's a story that asks us, can we still trust in the goodness of God when life doesn't make sense? Job's answer, though not immediately clear, reveals profound truth. His faith, unshaken by the worst trials imaginable, teaches us that even in the midst of the deepest pain, there is a purpose beyond our understanding. There is a divine wisdom at work. A wisdom that, while often hidden, ultimately points us toward a greater truth about God's sovereignty and love. In this video, we will walk through the stages of Job's trials, understanding his pain, his questions, and the wisdom he gains in the end. We will connect his ancient world to our own, and we will leave with a deeper understanding of what it means to endure, to trust, and to seek God's purpose in our suffering. Job's story is not just for those living in ancient times. It is for all of us who are faced with struggles that seem too big, too overwhelming, and too complex to understand. Job's journey teaches us that even when we don't understand the reasons behind our suffering, we can still trust in God's unchanging character. So let's take a deeper look at the Book of Job, not as a distant ancient tale, but as a living testimony to the power of faith, the depth of human suffering, and the sovereignty of God. As we unravel the lessons from Job's life, let's remember, in the end, it's not just about answering all the questions. It's about understanding the heart of God through the journey. To truly understand the depths of Job's story, we must first step into the world that shaped his life. Job's land, the land of Uz, is not just a backdrop for his trials. It's a place rich with history, culture, and significance. Though its exact location remains uncertain, scholars suggest it was likely in the region we now know as modern-day Saudi Arabia or northern Jordan, a land positioned at the crossroads of trade and ancient civilizations. Uz was a place where wealth and spirituality intertwined. It was a land of contrasts, prosperity mingling with vulnerability, abundance coexisting with hardship. Imagine, if you will, a vast, arid desert stretching out beneath a scorching sun. Job's world is one where the desert winds carry the scent of ancient trade routes, and the sounds of bustling caravans echo through the valleys. The land of Uz was strategically located, sitting at the junction of important trading routes, which brought prosperity to its people. It was a land where merchants from all corners of the ancient world passed through, exchanging goods, stories, and ideas. The result was a community that was not only wealthy in material goods, but also rich in cultural diversity. In Job's time, prosperity was often seen as a clear sign of divine favor. The more wealth, the greater the blessings of God. In contrast, suffering was equally tied to divine disfavor. This was a time when the connection between personal prosperity and spiritual well-being was deeply ingrained in the cultural consciousness. If someone was thriving, it was seen as evidence of God's favor. If they were suffering, it was assumed that they must have done something to deserve it. In this context, Job's great wealth and respect among his peers marked him as someone highly favored by God. His vast herds of livestock, his wealth in gold, and his many children were signs of divine blessing, a righteous man living in righteousness and honored by all. Yet, it is within this same context that Job's suffering would become all the more striking and perplexing. For Job to lose everything, his wealth, his health, and his family, would have been considered not only a personal tragedy, but also a spiritual crisis. How could a man so faithful, so upright in his actions, suddenly find himself in such misery? This is where Job's story becomes both a cultural and spiritual enigma. The land of Uz, with its trading crossroads and complex social structure, served as an ideal setting for Job's narrative. Its inhabitants would have been familiar with the volatility of life. In a land of wealth and opportunity, the specter of loss was always looming. And Job's story mirrored the delicate balance between riches and ruin that people lived with every day. The people of Uz knew well the fleeting nature of prosperity and the harsh realities of a world where survival was often dictated by forces beyond their control. This spiritual and cultural backdrop plays a significant role in shaping the emotional and theological questions at the heart of Job's story. In a world where wealth and suffering were seen as reflections of God's favor or punishment, Job's trials would seem incomprehensible to the people around him. Why would God allow a man like Job, someone who had lived righteously and with integrity, to fall so deeply into despair? The setting of Job's land becomes a mirror for the human condition. A place where all the wealth and honor one could desire may one day vanish without warning. And yet, even as Job's prosperity fades and his suffering intensifies, the land of Uz holds within it the possibility of transformation and understanding. Job's journey from wealth to destitution, from the heights of joy to the depths of pain, serves as a profound narrative of faith, questioning, and ultimate revelation. As we journey through Job's story, we'll uncover the profound wisdom hidden in his words and actions. But we must first remember the context in which this story unfolds. A world where divine favor and punishment seem to walk hand in hand, and where the riches of the land offered no guarantee of protection from life's most difficult trials. The land of Uz isn't just the setting for Job's story. It is a reflection of the fragility of human existence, an existence where, in the blink of an eye, everything can change, and where even the righteous must wrestle with suffering and loss. Job's story begins with a striking portrait of a man who seemed to have everything: wealth, family, health, and respect. Yet, what truly set Job apart wasn't just the external blessings he had, but the internal integrity and devotion that governed his life. Job's wealth was immense. He owned vast herds of livestock, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 oxen, and 500 donkeys. Such wealth would have secured his livelihood and earned respect and admiration from those around him. Job's family was equally blessed, with 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, living under his roof. His wealth extended far beyond material possessions. It represented his status as a man of success and honor, a man who had been blessed by God in every way. Despite this outward success, Job's true character was defined not by his wealth or his standing in society, but by his deep and unwavering commitment to living righteously in the eyes of God. Job wasn't merely wealthy in the physical sense. His wealth extended to his spiritual life as well, for he was a man deeply devoted to God. The Bible tells us that Job was blameless and upright, a man who feared God and shunned evil. Job 1:1. To be blameless meant Job had no known sin or fault that would warrant God's displeasure. He was a man who, in every respect, lived in accordance with the divine law. His integrity was not only a matter of outward conduct, but reflected a heart aligned with God's will. Job's life was also marked by his devotion to his family. He wasn't just a wealthy man who took care of his own needs. He was a father who cared deeply for his children. Job's family was not only blessed by his material wealth, but also by his spiritual leadership. The Bible tells us that after his children would host a feast, Job would rise early the next morning to offer burnt sacrifices on their behalf, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Job 1:5. Job's daily routine included offering sacrifices to ensure his children were spiritually cleansed, showing that his love for them was not merely protective, but deeply spiritual. His sacrifices were not just rituals. They were a reflection of his deep care and his awareness of the need for continual reconciliation with God. Despite his incredible wealth, Job's worship was simple and sincere. His wealth could have led him to rely on his material success, but instead, he constantly recognized his dependence on God. There was no pretense in his worship. Job did not rely on grand gestures or public displays of piety. His relationship with God was intimate and personal. In the quiet moments of his life, it was his heart for God that truly set him apart. He didn't need elaborate rituals to demonstrate his faith. His daily sacrifices and devotion to God were enough to express his sincerity. Job's worship was not dictated by his circumstances, but was a continual, personal act of faith. The simplicity of Job's worship contrasts sharply with the extravagance of his wealth. This juxtaposition teaches us that true relationship with God is not about the size of our possessions or the prominence of our status. It's about the authenticity of our devotion. Job's wealth did not define him. His relationship with God did. In a world where it's easy to get caught up in the pursuit of material gain, Job stands as a testament to the power of a heart that seeks God first. As we reflect on Job's character, we are prompted to ask ourselves, what does your life say about your relationship with God? Are you someone who, despite your circumstances, remains committed to living with integrity and devotion? How do you respond when life is going well, and how do you respond when it's not? Do you, like Job, make sacrifices to nurture your relationship with God, not just for yourself, but for those you love? Job's life challenges us to look beyond the surface and examine the depth of our relationship with God. It invites us to reflect on how our actions, attitudes, and priorities align with His will. Job's devotion wasn't just about following rules. It was about living a life that honored God in every area, from his work, to his family, to his worship. His faithfulness was rooted in a deep understanding of God's character and his own need for God's grace. As we explore Job's life further, we will see how his unwavering faith and integrity would be put to the ultimate test. But even as we face our own trials, Job's story remains a reminder that true faith is not built on what we have or don't have. It's built on a deep, personal relationship with a God who is always faithful, even in our darkest moments. In the opening chapters of the book of Job, we are drawn into a celestial scene where the divine realm meets the earthly struggles of mankind. The story takes an unexpected turn as God and Satan engage in a profound conversation that sets the stage for everything that follows. In this moment, we are introduced to a spiritual realm that is often unseen, where God's sovereignty is questioned, and the depth of Job's faith is put to the test. One day, as the sons of God gather before the Lord, Satan enters the scene among them. This is not a typical courtroom, but a divine assembly, a space where heavenly beings present themselves before God. Satan, known as the accuser, steps forward with a challenge. He questions Job's faith, suggesting that Job only worships God because of his blessings and material prosperity. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan asks, implying that Job's faith is shallow, rooted only in the rewards he receives from God. The essence of the challenge is this: if God removes Job's blessings, will Job still be faithful, or will his devotion crumble in the absence of material gain? God responds with confidence in Job's integrity, asking Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Job 1:8. It's a striking declaration, revealing God's belief in Job's character. God knows that Job's faith goes beyond the blessings he enjoys. His devotion is rooted in his relationship with God, not in what he receives from him. God permits Satan to test Job, but with clear limits. Job's possessions, health, and family may be taken, but his life is to remain untouched. Through this divine agreement, the tension between divine sovereignty and human suffering becomes evident. Why would God allow such a test? Why would a righteous man like Job endure such hardship? The answer is not immediately clear, but it's certain that Job's faith will be tested in ways that challenge everything he has known about God and life. Satan's role is critical in this confrontation. He serves as the accuser, questioning the authenticity of Job's faith. His challenge isn't just directed at Job, but at the very nature of faith itself. Satan seems to suggest that true faith only exists if there is something to gain from it. He wonders if Job's devotion is genuine, or if it is simply a response to the material blessings he receives from God. The question Satan poses, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" is a question that many of us face in different forms. Is our faith genuine only when life is good? Or do we still trust God even when everything falls apart? Satan's accusation forces us to ask whether we too would remain faithful if all our blessings were stripped away. Can we still trust God in the midst of suffering, even when we don't understand the reasons for our pain? God, however, does not merely permit the test for the sake of proving Job's worth. He allows the trial to reveal something much deeper: the nature of Job's relationship with him. God's sovereignty is not questioned by suffering. Instead, suffering is framed as a means of refining faith. Job's journey is not about receiving answers to his questions, but about learning to trust God, even in the most difficult of circumstances. God allows Job's pain, but that pain is not meaningless. It is part of a larger divine plan, a plan that Job cannot yet understand, but one that will lead to greater wisdom and growth. This divine challenge, though it may seem harsh, is ultimately about the purification of Job's faith. God's sovereignty allows for real human suffering, but that suffering is part of a process that will bring about a deeper understanding of God's ways. Job's faith will not be based on material blessings or outward success, but on his trust in the goodness of God, even when life doesn't make sense. As we reflect on this conversation between God and Satan, we are left with an important question. Why does God allow suffering? Is suffering always a punishment for sin, or can it serve a deeper purpose in our lives? And when our faith is tested, does that mean we have failed, or does it reveal an opportunity for our faith to grow stronger? The question that Satan asks, "Does Job fear God for nothing?" is not just a question for Job. It is a question for all of us. Are we faithful because of the blessings we receive, or are we faithful because of who God is? In a world where suffering is inevitable, Job's story invites us to consider whether we can trust God, not only in the good times, but also when life seems to be falling apart. As we continue through Job's journey, we see how his faith evolves, ultimately leading him to a deeper understanding of both himself and the God he serves. The challenge set by Satan, while painful, is the very catalyst for a faith that becomes unshaken, a faith that is rooted in the eternal truth of God's sovereignty and goodness. Job's life takes an unimaginable turn as a series of tragedies strikes him, one after another, shattering everything he had worked for and treasured. In a single heart-wrenching day, Job receives news that his wealth, his livestock, his servants, his livelihood is gone. He learns that the Sabaeans have raided his oxen and donkeys, while fire from heaven has consumed his sheep and the shepherds who tended them. Before he can even process the magnitude of these losses, another messenger arrives, reporting that the Chaldeans have taken his camels and killed those with them. And just when he believes it can't get worse, the final blow strikes. His 10 children, 7 sons, and 3 daughters are killed when a mighty wind collapses the house where they were feasting. Job's world, once full of blessings, is reduced to nothing in a matter of hours. The pain he feels is not only emotional but physical, as he absorbs the magnitude of his losses. His wealth, his status, his family, everything he held dear has been taken from him. It's a loss so profound that in any other context it would be impossible to bear. But Job's response to this devastating turn of events is nothing short of remarkable. Instead of falling into despair, Job falls to the ground and worships God. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Job 1:21. These words are not mere acceptance of his circumstances. They are an expression of deep faith. Job acknowledges God's sovereignty, even in the midst of his pain. He doesn't deny his suffering, but he chooses to worship God despite it all. This response is a testament to Job's relationship with God. His faith is not based on what he has or doesn't have, but on the unwavering trust he has in God's goodness, no matter what life brings. In the midst of this devastation, Job's wife offers a response that seems understandable but is filled with despair. As she sees Job in his grief, sitting in ashes and mourning the loss of everything, she tells him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." Job 2:9. In her grief, Job's wife cannot see a way out. She urges him to curse God, suggesting that there's no reason to continue living under such suffering. Her words, though rooted in her own pain, reflect the hopelessness that often comes when all seems lost. But Job's response to his wife is profound. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Job 2:10. Job's words are a quiet but powerful declaration of faith. He acknowledges that life is filled with both blessings and suffering, and that both come from the hand of God. His faith is not conditional on his circumstances. He recognizes that God, in his sovereignty, allows both the good and the bad, and he chooses to trust in God's plan, even when it doesn't make sense. Job's reaction teaches us a powerful lesson. When we face loss or hardship, how do we respond? Job's faith was not rooted in his wealth, his health, or his family. It was rooted in his understanding of who God is. His response to his suffering wasn't a demand for answers, but a humble submission to God's will. Job's unwavering faith in the midst of suffering challenges us to reflect on our own relationship with God. Do we worship him only when things are going well, or do we trust him even in the darkest moments? As we continue to explore Job's story, we see that his suffering doesn't stop here. But through it all, Job's understanding of God deepens. He wrestles with his pain, his questions, and his doubts, but he remains steadfast in his faith. Job's journey isn't about finding simple answers to his suffering. It's about learning to trust God in the midst of it, even when the reasons behind the pain remain hidden. Job's story calls us to examine the depth of our own trust in God. His response to his losses shows us that true faith is not built on external blessings, but on an intimate relationship with God that remains unshaken, even in the face of unimaginable suffering. As Job sits in the ashes of his grief, devastated by the loss of everything he once held dear, 3 of his friends arrive, hoping to offer him comfort. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, coming from different regions, gather around Job in solidarity, their hearts heavy with the weight of his pain. These were men who had known Job in his prosperous days, admired him, and respected his integrity. Now, they see him in the depths of despair, and their intentions are clear. They have come to mourn with him, to share in his sorrow, and to offer what comfort they can. When they first arrive, the friends do not rush to speak. They simply sit with Job in silence. They see the enormity of his suffering, and the depth of his grief is so profound that words seem inadequate. For 7 days and 7 nights, they remain silent, sitting beside Job without saying a word. This is a profound moment of empathy, an acknowledgement that sometimes the greatest comfort we can offer someone in pain is simply our presence. In this silence, we see a deep respect for Job's pain. The friends don't try to fix the situation or offer advice right away. They understand that grief is something that must be honored, not rushed through with words. There's something deeply human in this moment. In a world where we often feel the need to fill silence with words, Job's friends remind us that sometimes it's enough just to be there. This silence speaks volumes. It shows empathy, understanding, and a willingness to walk alongside someone in their suffering without trying to solve it or offer answers. How often do we feel the need to speak in moments of grief, when what the person may need most is simply a companion in their pain? Job's friends teach us a valuable lesson in the quiet strength of being present, of sitting with someone in their sorrow without feeling the pressure to fix their pain. But as the days pass, the silence begins to break. Job's friends start to speak, and this is where the tension begins. What started as a gesture of empathy soon turns into an uncomfortable series of attempts to explain Job's suffering. Their good intentions, it seems, do not quite hit the mark. The shift from silence to speech marks the beginning of their misunderstanding of Job's situation. While their initial presence was comforting, their words would soon add more pain than healing. This change is significant, and it reminds us that, while the silence was healing, the words that followed were not always helpful. This moment of silence with Job is worth reflecting on. How often do we find ourselves wanting to offer comfort, only to realize later that our words may have unintentionally added to someone's pain? In our desire to fix things, we sometimes speak too quickly or offer explanations that don't resonate with the person suffering. The arrival of Job's friends and their choice to sit in silence at first teaches us that sometimes the most powerful way to support someone is simply by being there. We don't always need to have the answers or say the right thing. Often, just sharing in someone's pain can be the most meaningful comfort we can offer. As we continue through Job's story, we will see how the friends' attempts to explain Job's suffering evolve into accusations and theological arguments. These words, though spoken with good intentions, miss the mark and contribute to the deepening tension between them and Job. Their understanding of suffering is too simplistic and rigid to account for the complexity of Job's pain. But for now, we can appreciate the lesson in their initial silence, that sometimes the best thing we can offer in the face of someone's suffering is not words, but simply our presence. We learn that sitting in silence with someone, sharing their grief, is an act of profound empathy that honors their pain without trying to make it go away. As Job sits in the depths of his suffering, having lost everything he once held dear, his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, arrive to offer what they hope will be comfort. These men, who had known Job in his prosperous days, now see him in the depths of despair. Their hearts are heavy, but they come with the intention of offering solace and understanding. However, their words take a different turn as they begin to accuse Job, convinced that his suffering is a direct result of some sin he must have committed. Eliphaz, the first to speak, begins with an approach that seems gentle compared to his friends. He suggests that Job's suffering must be the consequence of his sin. Drawing on the idea of retribution theology, the belief that suffering is always a result of personal wrongdoing, Eliphaz asserts that the righteous do not suffer unless they have sinned. He argues that suffering is never random. It is always a consequence of a person's actions. Eliphaz recalls a mysterious vision he had, where he learned that suffering serves to purify and correct the righteous. He encourages Job to repent, believing that if Job does, God will restore him to his former prosperity. Yet the problem with Eliphaz's reasoning is clear. Job is not a wicked man. His suffering cannot be easily explained by simple theology. Bildad, the next friend to speak, follows a similar line of reasoning, but takes a harsher tone. He insists that Job's suffering is a direct result of his sin, and even suggests that Job's children must have been punished for their own wrongdoings. If your children have sinned against him, he has given them over to the penalty of their sin, Bildad says, turning the tragedy of Job's loss into a harsh theological explanation. His words deepen Job's pain, as they imply that his children deserved their deaths. Bildad's approach, while rooted in the belief of God's justice, fails to recognize the complexity of Job's grief, leaving Job even more isolated in his suffering. Then there is Zophar, the harshest of the three, who cuts straight to the heart of the matter. He accuses Job of hiding some secret sin, and in his certainty, he claims that Job's suffering is actually light compared to what he truly deserves. Zophar's words are blunt and accusatory, suggesting that Job's misery is the result of his hypocrisy. Zophar fails to understand that Job's suffering is not about a hidden sin, it is about something far more complex. His words only add to the pain Job is already enduring, as Zophar dismisses his very real agony with a simple, cold judgment. In response to these accusations, Job's frustration reaches its peak. He does not remain silent. Instead, he questions the assumptions of his friends. His rebuttal is filled with raw emotion and honest frustration. Job's deep sorrow is evident as he wishes he had never been born, longing for an end to his suffering. He acknowledges God's sovereignty, but wrestles with the seeming injustice of his suffering. Job's words express the confusion and pain of someone who cannot understand why he is suffering when he has lived a righteous life. He challenges the simplistic explanations of his friends, knowing that the reasons for his suffering are far beyond their rigid theological beliefs. Job's struggles with his friends point to a deeper reality. Suffering cannot always be reduced to easy answers or simple formulas. The retribution theology that his friends cling to fails to account for the complexity of human suffering. While they insist that suffering is always deserved, Job's experience shows that suffering can be more than just a punishment for sin. Job's insistence on seeking a deeper understanding of his pain, rather than accepting his friends' simplistic explanations, reveals a faith that is willing to wrestle with God, to question, and to seek truth in the midst of hardship. The theological debate between Job and his friends forces us to confront the limitations of our own beliefs about suffering. How often do we try to explain someone's pain with quick, simple answers? How often do we feel the need to provide answers when, like Job, we may never fully understand the reasons behind the suffering we face? Job's story invites us to reflect on the complex nature of suffering and to recognize that there are times when questions remain unanswered, yet we are still called to trust in God's sovereignty. As Job continues his struggle with his friends, we are reminded that suffering is not always a punishment or a result of sin. Job's faith, despite his questions and doubts, remains unshaken because he refuses to accept the easy answers offered by his friends. His honest struggle with God shows us that faith is not about having all the answers, but about holding on to trust, even in the midst of pain and confusion. Job's story invites us to consider the complexity of suffering and to question the simplistic answers we often offer to those who are hurting. In the midst of Job's unimaginable suffering, a torrent of raw emotion erupts from within him. After days of silence and brief moments of resilience, Job's deep anguish breaks through, pouring out in a lament that expresses more than just sorrow. It's a profound questioning of his very existence, a cry from the depths of his soul that feels utterly abandoned. In Job 3, he speaks words that resonate with anyone who has ever faced the cruel weight of life's suffering, wondering why things have turned so dark and what purpose life serves when it seems so unfair. Job's lament begins with a powerful, painful question. Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? Job 3:11. His pain is so overwhelming that he wishes he had never been born, as his life has become nothing but a series of relentless tragedies. The life he once had, filled with prosperity and purpose, now seems like a cruel joke. In the wake of such devastating loss, Job begins to challenge the very purpose of his existence. He questions why life was given to him at all if it was only to suffer. Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? Job 3:23, he asks, feeling as though God has placed an impenetrable barrier between him and any hope of relief. His existence feels pointless, and he is left grappling with the idea that life itself might have no greater meaning if it only leads to pain. Job's lament isn't merely about the personal loss he has experienced. It's about questioning the very essence of life. He wonders why people like him, who once lived with integrity and honor, are now subjected to such crushing agony. He expresses the feeling of betrayal by life itself, asking, "For what is our lot from God above? our heritage from the Almighty. Job 31:2. What is the purpose of a life filled with so much pain, he wonders. Job speaks of the futility of existence, where joy and suffering seem to alternate without reason. Why is light given to those in misery, and life to the bitter of soul? Job 3:20. His questioning expands beyond his personal agony, touching on the existence of suffering itself. Why do the innocent suffer while others seem to live without such hardship? This question, one that Job wrestles with, is at the heart of his struggle and remains a timeless question for all who endure pain. Job's lament is a raw, unfiltered expression of his deepest anguish. He doesn't try to sugarcoat his feelings or put on a brave face. His words are harsh, but they are honest, as he questions the meaning of his suffering and the justice of life itself. Job, the righteous man, finds himself in a place where the very foundations of his understanding of life and faith are shaken. He does not understand why he is suffering, and the explanations offered by his friends only deepen his frustration. His lament is not an accusation against God, but a deep cry for meaning in the face of pain, a cry that longs for answers, but doesn't receive them. As Job's lament continues, his questioning of life's purpose deepens. For what is our lot from God above, our heritage from the Almighty? Job 31 verse 2. Job wonders if the life he once took for granted was a mere illusion, built on fleeting moments of joy that now seem utterly meaningless. The life he had, full of blessings, now appears to have been a temporary reprieve before the inevitable pain arrived. Job's lament touches on the universal human experience of questioning the fairness of life, especially when suffering seems so random and undeserved. His words speak to anyone who has faced grief, loss, or hardship, and wondered why life has to be so painful. In his lament, Job also questions why others, like him, must endure such misery while others seem untouched by suffering. Why is light given to those in misery and life to the bitter of soul? Job 3:20. Job's question here is not just about his own pain, it is about the unfairness of the world, where good people suffer and others seem to live carefree lives. Job's lament becomes an existential cry, a search for justice and meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and unfair. Job's raw expression of pain teaches us something profound about how we approach God in times of suffering. He doesn't hide his pain or pretend that everything is okay. He brings his doubts, his frustration, and his pain before God with honesty. In doing so, Job shows us that it is okay to bring our struggles to God, to question, to express our anger, and to mourn. Job's lament is not a sign of weak faith. Rather, it's an expression of a deep and honest faith that is willing to wrestle with God in the midst of suffering. When we face suffering in our own lives, it's easy to feel the need to cover up our emotions, to put on a brave face, or to offer what we think are the right words. But Job's lament shows us that God welcomes our honest expressions of pain. God doesn't shy away from Job's questions or his emotional outbursts. He meets Job in the rawness of his grief, offering neither judgment nor condemnation, but the space for Job to wrestle with his pain. Job's lament teaches us that God understands our suffering and invites us to bring our honest emotions before him, not to pretend that everything is fine, but to lean into his presence in the midst of our pain. As we reflect on Job's lament, we see that suffering, while deeply painful, does not diminish our relationship with God. Job's willingness to bring his anguish to God without pretense or sugarcoating demonstrates that true faith is not about having all the answers, but about trusting God with the questions. Suffering, Job shows us, doesn't make us weak, it makes us human. And God is with us in our humanity, understanding our struggles and offering us his presence, even when we don't have all the answers. In Job's lament, we find the courage to be honest with God, knowing that in the midst of our pain, he is present and willing to meet us where we are. After Job's friends had spent days accusing him and offering their narrow, rigid explanations for his suffering, a young man named Elihu enters the scene. Unlike the three older friends, Elihu has been quietly observing the entire debate. He is frustrated, not just with Job, but also with his friends. They have all missed the point, his friends in their overconfidence, and Job in his despair. Elihu's voice introduces a fresh perspective that challenges the assumptions of both sides, and in doing so, he forces Job to reconsider his understanding of suffering. Elihu's first words are not to comfort Job, but to criticize his friends for their failure to understand the nature of God's justice. They had insisted that suffering was always a result of sin, that Job's trials must be a direct punishment for some hidden wrongdoing. But Elihu argues that their theology is flawed. He speaks out against their simplistic understanding of divine justice. In his eyes, they have all missed the bigger picture. He goes on to say that suffering is not always a result of punishment, but can be a means of refining the soul. Elihu's argument shifts the conversation from the idea of suffering as retribution to understanding it as a process of spiritual growth. He suggests that God uses suffering not just to punish, but to purify and refine people, much like a metalworker refines precious metal through fire. Elihu explains that God speaks in one way and in two, though man does not perceive it. Job 33:14. This means that God's ways are often hidden from human understanding, and suffering might be part of a divine plan we don't fully grasp. Suffering, according to Elihu, can be a tool that God uses to help people grow, to turn their hearts toward Him, and to make them more aware of their need for divine guidance. Elihu then addresses Job directly. While Job has been questioning God's justice and accusing God of being unfair, Elihu challenges him to see that God is always just, even when his actions seem incomprehensible. He argues that Job's suffering is not meaningless or the result of some sin, but a part of God's greater plan for refining his character. God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Job 36:22. Elihu reminds Job. In this, he offers an important insight. God's justice might not always align with our human expectations, but that doesn't mean it's flawed. Sometimes God's ways transcend our understanding, and in those moments, faith is required. Throughout Elihu's speeches, we see a shift in the way suffering is portrayed. Instead of simply being a punishment for wrongdoing, suffering is reframed as something that can lead to deeper spiritual insight. He is chastened with pain upon his bed and with constant distress in his bones. 19. Elihu says, explaining that suffering can be a wake-up call that leads people back to God. It serves to refine and purify, to bring a person closer to understanding God's will, even when it's painful. While Job's friends were quick to accuse and Job was quick to question, Elihu introduces a deeper understanding of God's purposes. He challenges Job to stop focusing on the fairness of his suffering and to see it as part of a larger divine process. Elihu acknowledges that suffering is difficult to endure, but he suggests that it is often a tool used by God to shape us into better, more faithful individuals. Elihu's perspective on suffering leaves us with a significant question. How can suffering shape our character and bring us closer to God? For Job, his suffering led him into a deeper wrestling with his faith and his understanding of God. Elihu's words suggest that suffering is not just something to endure, but something that can refine us, make us more spiritually aware, and draw us nearer to God's purposes. Elihu's challenge to Job is a challenge to all of us. When we face suffering, are we willing to see it not just as a trial, but as an opportunity for spiritual growth and transformation? After all the discussions, debates, and laments, God finally responds to Job. His answer comes not in words of explanation, but through a mighty display of his power. God speaks to Job out of the whirlwind, a force of nature that embodies his divine presence. It's a reminder that God's ways are beyond comprehension, and his authority is absolute. Instead of offering a simple explanation for Job's suffering, God asks a series of questions that challenge Job's understanding of creation, justice, and the divine order of the universe. God begins by asking, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations?" Job 38:4. This question marks the beginning of a barrage of questions that highlight Job's limited understanding of the world and of God's role as the creator. God asks about the creation of the earth, the seas, the stars, and even the wild animals. He speaks of the cosmos, of the seas being locked in place, and of the wild animals that roam the earth. Through these questions, God is reminding Job of his ultimate authority over everything. Job, who had questioned the fairness of his suffering, is now confronted with the vastness of God's sovereignty. God's actions in creation, his mastery over the universe, are beyond human understanding, and his wisdom surpasses anything Job could comprehend. God's words are not an accusation, but a revelation. Job's suffering is not explained away by a simple answer. Instead, it's placed in the context of a much greater reality, one that Job cannot fully grasp. God's questions emphasize the fact that suffering does not diminish his sovereignty. In fact, it points to a deeper reality, one that transcends human understanding. Job's pain, though real and profound, is part of a world that God has created, a world where his justice and wisdom are far greater than Job's ability to comprehend. When God speaks, it's not just about the mechanics of creation or the intricacies of the universe. It's about the relationship between God and humanity. Job's suffering, though painful, is part of the mystery of life, a mystery that involves both God's sovereignty and human experience. The theological implication here is profound. Suffering does not diminish God's sovereignty. It highlights a reality that is beyond our comprehension. We cannot always understand why we suffer, but that does not mean that God is any less in control. Instead, our suffering points to a divine mystery, a reality where God's wisdom and justice are greater than our understanding. As God speaks to Job, his revelation isn't just about the physical world, it's about the nature of suffering itself. Job's pain is not meaningless, nor is it a punishment for sin. God's response challenges Job to see beyond the pain, beyond the questions, and to recognize that suffering, though deeply troubling, is part of the larger picture of God's sovereign will. There's a divine wisdom at work that Job cannot fully grasp, but it's there, guiding the unfolding of creation and human existence. For Job, the encounter with God transforms his perspective on suffering. He does not receive the answers he hoped for, but he gains something deeper, a sense of awe before the majesty of God. When Job encounters God's power, his complaints about suffering begin to fade. He recognizes that, even in his pain, God's sovereignty remains unchallenged. Job is humbled, not by an answer to his questions, but by the overwhelming realization of God's greatness and authority. His encounter with God shifts his focus from trying to understand his suffering to submitting to the divine will that is beyond human comprehension. This personal encounter with God changes Job. He begins to see his suffering in a new light, not as a pointless tragedy, but as part of a larger divine plan that he cannot fully understand. For Job, the moment of divine revelation does not erase his pain, but it shifts his perspective. Suffering, instead of being a question of fairness or justice, becomes a part of the divine mystery that Job is invited to trust in. This encounter with God brings Job to a place of humility. He no longer demands answers or explanations, but submits to the reality of God's power and wisdom. In the face of the whirlwind, Job's own perspective shrinks. He understands that he cannot see the whole picture, and he chooses to trust in the goodness of God despite the pain he continues to feel. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. Job 42:2, Job declares. This is a moment of surrender, a moment when Job's heart shifts from resistance to trust. In this encounter, we see that suffering is not the final word. The final word belongs to God's sovereignty. Job's response teaches us that, in the face of suffering, our perspective must change. When we encounter God in the midst of our pain, we may not receive all the answers we long for, but we gain something more important, a deeper understanding of who God is. How does a personal encounter with God change our perspective on suffering? It shifts us from a focus on the pain itself to a recognition of God's greatness, His sovereignty, and His wisdom. Even when we don't understand why we suffer, we can trust that God is with us, and that His purposes, though hidden, are always good. After Job encounters God in the whirlwind, his perspective shifts entirely. God's questions have humbled him, and he recognizes his limitations in understanding the vastness of divine wisdom. Job's response is immediate and profound. He confesses his lack of knowledge and repents for speaking about matters he did not fully comprehend. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted, he acknowledges. Job 42:2. Job admits that while he had heard of God, now he has seen him with his own eyes. Job 42:5. This encounter has moved him from mere intellectual knowledge to a personal, intimate understanding of God's greatness. Job humbly accepts that his previous complaints were based on his human limitations, not a true understanding of God's will. With Job's confession and repentance, God then turns his attention to Job's friends. "I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." Job 42:7. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who had insisted on the retribution theology and accused Job of hidden sin, are rebuked by God. Their understanding of Job's suffering was too simplistic and failed to grasp the complexity of God's purposes. Unlike Job, who sought God in the midst of his pain, they offered rigid and unhelpful theological explanations. God, in his grace, commands Job to pray for his friends, saying, "My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly." Job 42:8. This moment is pivotal. Job, who had once been the one needing intercession, is now called to pray for his friends, acting as a mediator between them and God. Following this act of mercy and restoration, Job's life is abundantly restored. God blesses him with twice as much wealth as he had before, and his family is returned to him. He is given 7 sons and 3 daughters just as before, and his new children are described as beautiful, with the daughters noted for their beauty and wisdom. Job 42:13-15. Job is granted many more years to live, and he sees his descendants to the 4th generation. The latter part of Job's life is far more blessed than the first, demonstrating God's faithfulness and the reality that suffering does not have the final word. God's justice, though not always understood in the moment, is ultimately redemptive. Job's restoration shows us that suffering, while difficult and painful, does not define our relationship with God forever. While Job endured great loss and deep suffering, God's restoration was not just a return to what he had lost. It was a far greater blessing. Job's transformation from a man who questioned God's justice to one who accepted his sovereignty serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of humility in suffering. It also teaches us that God's justice is not punitive, but restorative, working through the hardest of circumstances to refine and bless. Job's story is a testimony to the fact that even in our darkest moments, God's faithfulness is unshaken, and he has the power to bring restoration that far exceeds our expectations. In the end, Job's restoration is not just about his material wealth or family being returned, but about the deepening of his relationship with God. Through his suffering, Job's faith was refined, and he gained a deeper understanding of God's ways. God's justice and faithfulness do not depend on our circumstances, but on his unchanging character. Job's journey reminds us that suffering is not the end of the story. God's plans for us are good, even when we cannot see them, and he has the power to bring new life and restoration, even from the deepest pain.